Okay, hello everyone. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm at the beginning. Okay, so as you know, we're going to talk about culturally sustaining pedagogy. And I'm going to sort of connect this theory to the idea of disrupting whiteness through a lived curriculum. So to begin, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to go through and then a bit of a background on culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So in my facilitation, I'm going to sort of have three focuses. The first will be the foundations of culturally relevant and responsive models. And of course, I'll discuss why these models came to be and give some relevant examples and some support materials. And then next, we'll look at the importance of critical race theory and intentionality in these contemporary models of educational theory, because both really worked concurrently. And again, we'll look at why. And then third, I will discuss the loving critique forward, which is offered by Paris and Alim, interrogating whiteness while minimizing its gaze through the idea of culturally sustaining practices. So after that, again, we'll look at why. So beginning with culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, I focus mainly on culturally relevant, which was theorized by Gloria Ladson-Billings. For culturally responsive pedagogy, that was more Geneva Gay, which is also great theory. There's a lot of overlapping, but my area of expertise is more with Ladson-Billings' work. So it emerges a response to traditional theories in education that emphasized the quote-unquote achievement gap in schooling and sought to address why there was such a disparity between white and racialized student success. So something that I like about more contemporary theories in educational theory that are working on cultural relevance and culturally sustaining is that they look at more intersecting categories of difference that go beyond race, culture, and class. Because as we know, these things are also interconnected. So models of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy began to put the onus onto the institution of schooling itself instead of the children who were performing, and I wish I had put this in quotations, poorly. So Gloria Ladson-Billings has proposed three criteria for culturally relevant pedagogy: student academic success, students develop or maintain cultural competence. So there's this idea of performing whiteness or acting white, and it was important to Ladson-Billings, as it is to most culturally relevant pedagogy, that students maintain their cultural integrity. And the third is that students develop a critical consciousness and challenge the social order. So it's one thing to sort of learn these cultural codes, perform well in school, while maintaining their cultural integrity. And it's another to move forward and be able to have the tools to challenge the status quo. These are some resources that I wanted to offer you. I'm not going to go through them right now, but they're really excellent resources. So the first one here is a series of videos as well as sort of an essay on culturally responsive pedagogy. It's really great, and I think it'll give you a really solid background. The second is a YouTube video that talks about public education in regard to reproducing poverty. And this really ties into the third link, which is a video, and again, there's a bit of an article there that's arguing for the integration of different socioeconomic and racial background children in the same schools, because there's a whole body of research that shows that all students benefit. So I hope you check those out. So now I'm going to move into some foundations in critical race theory. So I have a couple images here on the right that look at the school to prison pipeline. So again, there's a large body of research that has shown that schools can actually function in society to sort of punish and criminalize certain behavior at a young age, and it actually leads to children being pushed into the prison system. And we know that these children represented in the prison system are typically racialized. Especially in Canada, there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black individuals in the prison system. So for that reason, I've included this article on the left from Maclean's that just gives like a Canadian context. And the title is Canadian Prisons Are the New Residential Schools. So if you want to check that out. There's also a quote here from Ladson-Billings' article in 1995 that talks about how, well, it's an assertion from a Native American educator, an Indigenous educator, asserting that one of the reasons that Indigenous children experienced difficulty in schools was that educators traditionally attempted to insert culture into education, instead of inserting education into the culture. So this notion, in all probability, is true for many students who are not a part of the white middle-class mainstream. We can see here Ladson-Billings is flipping the paradigm and just suggesting that rather than trying to fit students into the education system, we should be trying to radically alter the education system so that it is not limited to benefiting only white students. So some essential understandings. Here I've included, this is not exhaustive by any means, but here I have included some sort of like different tenets of critical race theory that I have seen coming up throughout the class so far. And of course I have the phenomenology of whiteness here, which is one of the articles that I had included for this week. I've also included this quote, which is actually from an article that Lisa sent me that I thought was really great for sort of acknowledging the ways that critical race theory has historically failed to address colonialism. And furthermore, it really problematizes multiculturalism and sort of like the story of multiculturalism in Canada, which is used to really individualize racism and to sort of give this idea that racism is a thing of the past and that Canada has moved beyond it. And they point to how that is not the case. And really, multiculturalism works to erase the struggles of people who face racism every day as it is embedded in social institutions. So here I've just sort of given a little bit on Black feminist thought, as Black feminists were among the first to begin to challenge deficit models of education and recognize the connections between differing forms of oppression. And then there's decolonization theory, which we've looked at quite a bit throughout the course, which is really great. So concurrent with Black feminist thought, Indigenous resistance and resurgence has been challenging Eurocentrism in Western education, highlighting settler ontologies, which tend to separate the mind, body, and spirit. Some more recent authors, as I have mentioned, have challenged critical race theory's complicity in colonial legacies. So it's really important to consider this when you're looking at culturally relevant pedagogy because it is so closely related to critical race theory. And then, of course, we have Ahmed's phenomenology of whiteness. So in this article, Ahmed picks up on transnational feminist thought, Black feminist thought, decolonization, in order to establish a phenomenology of whiteness. She argues that whiteness may function as a form of public comfort by allowing bodies to extend into spaces that have already taken their shape. So she follows along the footsteps of critical thinkers before her who also flipped the script and placed the emphasis for analysis on whiteness. So we know from DS1 and from my presentation in that course that James Baldwin did the same thing. She talks about authors like Frantz Fanon, Richard Dyer, and of course Toni Morrison. So what Ahmed has done here, I would argue so beautifully, is to point to the way in which certain institutions and public spaces have actually become oriented towards certain races because of what is considered neutral and what has been expected. And she talks a lot about the way that certain bodies are oriented in the world and how the white body is more oriented to feel comfortable in really most spaces that it takes up. Of course, this is something that doesn't apply as much to an experience of, say, a white educator traveling and teaching English abroad. Although there are a lot of ways in which the pervasiveness of whiteness has traveled across borders. So that's a whole sort of different area for conversation. But there's this one part in Ahmed's article where she writes, whiteness would be what lags behind. So when she says lags behind, she means behind the body. White bodies do not have to face their whiteness. They are not oriented towards it. And this not is what allows whiteness to cohere, as that which bodies are oriented around. When bodies lag behind, then they extend their reach. So she's really pointing in this article to the way in which racialized bodies experience the world differently, and thus they experience institutions differently. And this is just something that I wanted to get us to think about. My computer is dying, so I might pause this recording and hopefully be able to part 2. So I've included a couple links here. One is a link to a video called The Hidden Identity of Whiteness, that if you're kind of like, what is this whiteness? It's a really good overview, and it goes into sort of what that terminology means. And then here, a link to an article by Robin DiAngelo, who is a really great author to seek out if you're looking for more information on whiteness. And she writes a lot about white fragility. So there's actually the link to the full article there, which is pretty great. I'm not going to show the video. So moving into culturally sustaining pedagogy. So culturally sustaining pedagogy has these 3, similar to Lads and Billings, it has these 3 tenets. So 1, it resists static and unidirectional notions of culture and race. So it emphasizes the ways that youth often practice intercultural modes of being that actually cross boundaries. So things are much more fluid, and there already sort of is this intercultural dynamic. So CSP lends itself well to an intersectional analysis of curriculum because it's cognizant of the vast areas of difference that exist beyond race and culture, as I touched upon earlier. It also focuses on pluralist outcomes, which do not center white, middle class, monocultural, able-bodied, heteronormative norms of educational achievement. So in response to critiques like Delpit's that power only shifts when cultural codes are passed down, Paris and Aleem argue that the dominant white cultural capital is no longer the only cultural capital that leads to success in an increasingly pluralistic world. So their argument is that actually it is white students who will benefit from learning cultural pluralism in an increasingly international, intercultural world. And third, culturally sustaining pedagogy, or CSP, encourages educators and students to recognize the fluidity of power and privilege, addressing the problematic as well as progressive aspects of different communities. So it calls on all of us to acknowledge the shortcomings of our own constantly shifting cultural positions. Paris and Alim, in their article on culturally sustaining pedagogy, offer what they call a loving critique forward from culturally relevant models. And they ask for what purposes and with what outcomes. So they're mainly concerned with the way that previous formulations, and they specifically name Latz and Billings, laid the groundwork for maintaining heritage and cultural ways and encouraging students to critique dominant power structures. However, the term relevance has done little to explicitly support its own goals. And they are concerned with ways that the oversimplification of asset pedagogies as solely being about heritage or traditional practices is ignoring the shifting and evolving practices of certain communities. So it's sort of allowing for this interesting process of like celebrating different cultures, and again, this model of injecting culture into the education model and into curriculum rather than drastically remodeling the curriculum itself. So they say, what happens when, rather than challenging hegemonic ideas and outcomes, the cultural practices of youth of color actually reproduce them or even create new ones? Indeed, most of the research and practice under asset pedagogy's umbrella, including the frameworks of the funds of knowledge, the pedagogical third space, and culturally relevant pedagogy, too often view youth culture through a purely positive or progressive lens. This is true as well for the pedagogical traditions founded on these frameworks, like the hugely influential hip-hop pedagogy movement. So they're really looking at the way that power is still reproduced. And I find this really, really critical when engaging with the sorts of ideas that Ellsworth was bringing forward in her article, Why Doesn't This Feel Empowering? So I feel like she was really coming to terms with this idea that there's often this conception that when we have a diverse population in our classes, that will automatically mean that these power dynamics begin to dissolve. When realistically, every individual, every culture, every community has their own ways of reproducing harmful power dynamics. While they also have incredible assets, which is what this article is saying. So there really needs to be a model of pedagogy that acknowledges this and that works to promote critical self-reflexivity. So speaking of that, I want to move into sort of connections between all of the readings from this week and like the themes, while sort of asking you this general rhetorical question. How might we as educators and researchers engage in a refusal to measure knowledge against a standard Eurocentric white conception of academic success? So I think that Tilley and Taylor, for those of you who have read this article, do a really great job of sort of navigating this question of what happens when we disrupt and challenge processes of whiteness in the classroom. So in this article, Susan Tilley and Leanne Teller, who are both professors in education at Brock, they describe the way that they engaged in a process of critical reflexivity to build understanding of their praxis. So what actually occurred was Susan had taught a class that it was a graduate student course, and they talked about education and race, and they really worked to have students address whiteness and white privilege and talk about what happens when you talk about race in the classroom. So Susan then went on sabbatical, and Leanne Taylor took over the course. And they were really interested in the ways that the curriculum and the processes of this class shifted and changed depending on who was teaching it and who was in the class. Susan as a white tenured professor, middle class, and Leanne as a mixed race black middle class professor who was non-tenured at the time. So they found that, I'm just going to read this quote because I think it really succinctly sums up what they found. So, students have been informed by a discourse of race and whiteness in which they are socialized to see whiteness as neutral, race as a concern of the past, their privileges as earned, and the maintenance of a colorblind stance as important in their teaching. So, concerns that were shared by Leanne's students regarding the well-being of racialized students, specifically students, were asking a lot of questions about Leanne's racial positioning and expressing a lot of concern for her own well-being. And Tilly and Taylor found that this kept the focus on the other and not on the students themselves, or how their identities played a role in their own teaching, because they were graduate students in the education program. So for this reason, both educators attempted to look at whiteness as an entry point into analyzing the role of race in education. But as the article illustrates, this was met with a great deal of discomfort and denial from their students. So here is a quote taken from the findings of the article. When we emphasized the connections between lived curriculum and race, racial identities, and difference, we added another layer of complexity with which students found difficult to contend. So there's a great deal of experience that's shared in the article that points to the ways in which students did not want to confront discussions of race. They did not want to talk about whiteness. And anytime that they would engage with the topic of race, they chose mainly, including racialized students, they chose mainly to frame it as though it was something that they were not a part of, which is really important to consider when we're looking at how whiteness as neutral, how whiteness as the way that public spaces are oriented, whiteness as comfortable. When we're looking at that, and we're trying to disrupt that and challenge that, I think it's really important to look at the ways that discourses of race as they exist in most educational models, they reproduce these processes. And it creates a lot of work for those of us who are working to disrupt that, but it's of critical importance. So how are the spaces we teach and work within, as well as our conception of knowledge, reproducing white supremacy? Again, I want to remind you that white supremacy is the structural domination of whiteness. So we are living in a white supremacist society. So Ahmed here says, a phenomenology of whiteness helps us to notice institutional habits. It brings what is behind, what does not get seen as the background to social action, to the surface in a certain way. So a phenomenology of whiteness, she's saying, puts the pressure back on what's going on without being said. So it's so much easier to point to individual acts of racism and say, this is bad, and this is unusual, and this is not what we do in Canada. We're multicultural. But Ahmed is saying, if we shift the paradigm and if we focus on how whiteness is embedded in our social structures, then it makes it easier to notice these habits, and it makes it easier to notice how certain institutions are more oriented towards whiteness. And, she's not offering a solution, and she's saying that there doesn't need to be a solution offered, because in a way, that just makes it easier. She's pointing to a problem, And she's saying that this is a problem for white people to address. And I think that is so critically important. So, and then on the flip side of this, we have, and I recognize that most of you won't have read both of these. So on the flip side of this, we have Tilly and Taylor. And they're saying here, many of the students were invested in particular notions of curriculum that allowed them to accept and resist certain knowledge as valid. Curriculum was understood as something that should be easy to digest, not make them angry, and should align with their worldviews. So I think here we're seeing the ways in which whiteness plays out in curriculum. We're seeing the ways that many white students have come to be comfortable and to see institutions as comfortable and see themselves as neutral within those institutions. And when we begin to problematize this, when we begin to disrupt these habits, then there's real potential there for setting up a culturally sustaining, lived curriculum that can move us forward as a culturally pluralistic society. So, depending on the experiences and realities of individuals in our periphery, there are different options for entering into discussions on whiteness and the prevalence of white supremacy. And this is where lived curriculum comes into play. Tilly and Taylor offer one such example where they push students to consider their privilege and critically reflect on race. Can you think of other examples? Through engaging with CSP in conjunction with lived curriculum, we might extend opportunities for open and honest conversations regarding race and other points of difference. This creates further space for interrogating the ways that our varying social identities can work to privilege or marginalize us, and to problematize our own vastly different worldviews. Some implications. Could discussing whiteness in conjunction with culturally sustaining pedagogy work to recenter the standard Eurocentric experience? How might we ensure that we interrogate whiteness and challenge the orientation of public spaces in regard to said whiteness without reproducing the silencing of racialized voices? These are just some questions to consider. Is it naive of Paris and Alim to argue that monocultural capital is becoming a thing of the past? What if our students still resist and insist on being taught the dominant cultural codes, as we see with Tilly and Taylor? Isn't this their right? So these are just some questions that I want you to think about going forward. The synthesis and the further discussion parts of the presentation are going to be a mystery for now, but I'll add to that later. Okay, great.